And joining me in this semicircle, I'm going to bring them on. I see Fang, President and CEO of Radio Free Asia, if you can have a seat over there. And Emmanuel Chenze, COO of Africa Uncensored, right next to. Where's Manisha Pandey, Managing Director of News Laundry? Yes, thanks so much for joining us. Last but not least, Madhav Chinappa, what do I call you? A thought leader on news innovation?
Just a news guy.
Thank you. Well, before we get things kicking, I know that they want to throw up a question for the audience that hopefully you will not be shy about participating in. If we can throw that up, the question is, what's an innovative format your newsroom uses to cover elections? So if you can see that QR code and use your phone, and then, I don't know, there you go, there you go. There's a QR code, use your phone, point your camera at it, and then it'll take you to a website, and I will check in right before we go to Q&A to see your contributions. I'm aware that I'm kind of standing between you and lunch, so we'll get this going. I'll start with Bay. Can you talk about Radio Free Asia's approach to elections this year? What are some of the forces at play that your organization is focused on?
Yeah, thank you so much, and it's really nice to be here. Thank you. So Radio Free Asia was created after the Tiananmen Square massacres happened in 1989 in China. So that was when the communist government decided to use its troops to shoot on pro-democracy protesters on Tiananmen Square, and then covered up the news and censored it for its own people. So the US Congress decided that it would be beneficial to create a news service that brought free press to countries in Asia, including China, that don't have access to free press. So the idea, our mission, is to cover these countries, like give them the domestic news of what's happening around them, and as an uncensored news organization, and not to propagandize about the U.S. So we have a strict firewall between what we cover and the U.S. government. So we're situated in kind of a unique space where we're countering disinformation from state-sponsored disinformation in some of the world's most closed countries. So into China, we broadcast in Mandarin, Cantonese, Tibetan, and we have the only Uyghur service in the world. And then we also cover North Korea in Korean. We get inside that country, and then we also have some languages in Southeast Asia. And so, as you can imagine, there's not much overlap between the countries that we cover and elections.
Although it could go in the other direction in terms of informing North Koreans or what's happening outside, right?
That's right. So, I mean, so we are trying to cover the domestic news in like what's happening, but this year it's unusual in that there is a very real campaign of disinformation waged by authoritarian countries such as China and Russia to seed not just disinformation that favors whatever candidates they're interested in, but also to seed doubt and mistrust in the democratic system writ large. So what we've seen, so we created something called the Asia Fact Check Lab, and what we've seen in, for example, in Taiwan, which was one of the first elections this year in January, there was a very real campaign by the CCP to it was in little ways. So for example, they created a fake poll at one point that suddenly came out of nowhere saying that the opposition KMT candidate, which was their favored candidate, was ahead in the polls. So the Asia Fact Check Lab, which basically looks at misinformation on social media and where it comes from. So they traced, the people who were behind this poll, how they were funded, where they had traveled, and found, of course, that it was funded by the Chinese Communist Party. But then, more broadly, we also look at some of what China is trying to do in other parts of the world, such as in the US. So, for example, last year, just after the Maui wildfires began, on Chinese social media, there was suddenly all of this, sort of viral photos and the conspiracy theory that the wildfires were started by a weapons test by the U.S. And this was just on Chinese originated accounts, but it was in like 31 different languages.
Can I just back up and, for that weapons test sort of story, is that something that's also being perpetuated domestically in China? Or do we see a difference in terms of the domestic propaganda versus their outward-facing attempts at disinformation?
Well, in this case, it was everywhere. So they were doing it in Mandarin, they were doing it in like obscure languages and African languages. So it was all over the place. But they were using AI to create these photos that were circulated. What the Asia Fact Check Lab did was we did reverse image searches and actually found that the images that they were circulating were from a 2018 electrical storm in a town called Kenner in Louisiana, of all places.
Very far away from Hawaii.
Yes, exactly.
By the way, in case anyone doesn't know.
So, I think this kind of work that they were doing, using AI, using bots, using fake social media accounts, kind of presages what they might try to do in elections.
But I would just point out that with the Taiwan elections, for example, it didn't work. Right? Beijing did not get the candidate they wanted as president.
Yes, and that's very important to note. Their tactics didn't work, and that was partly due to Taiwan. I mean, they had practice because there was a lot of disinformation sowed by China in their previous elections a few years earlier, but so they've learned from that, but also the work that other journalists are doing.
Great, thank you very much. Manisha. You've been very, very busy covering the elections in India. Gosh, I don't even know where to begin, but maybe can you talk a little bit about news laundry and then also about Modi's relationship with the mainstream media, which you are decidedly not a part of, correct?
Happily not part of, but okay. So I work in an organization called News Laundry. News laundry meaning we take news to the cleaners. We started off in 2012, and the idea was that, media and journalists, we get to ask questions of everyone, of politicians, bureaucrats, film stars, sports stars, but we're never open to being asked questions ourselves. And we felt in India that there was a need to start a conversation on the media, ask questions of the media. The idea that journalists are somehow above, being questioned just because they are in a position to question others, we want to challenge that. So a core responsibility and a core work that News Laundry does is to question the media, look at propaganda in media, look at issues of ownership, media control. And I do a satire show, actually, weekly satire show that looks at the state of television news in India. And it's very fascinating to look at television news, especially given the election that we've just had. We have a very diverse media ecosystem in India, 400 news channels, over 1 lakh newspapers. But a sizable section of the mainstream television news in India, big media, 14 to 15 channels that have wide reach, that can define the discourse of an election, that has massive impact on policy, completely operated as a megaphone for the government in power over the last 10 years. We did a survey, in fact, in the run-up to elections, looking at 6 primetime news channels, debates, and we found that a sizable amount of time is spent on demonizing the opposition, whether it's calling them anti-nationals or portraying opposition as this motley bunch of people who aren't really capable of ruling or questioning anyone who did not agree with the government in power. The other part, a sizable chunk of time, is devoted to building up the cult of Modi, what a great leader he is, how he's put India on the world map, He apparently also stopped the war between Russia and Ukraine, for those of you who aren't aware. This was a huge part of the BJP's campaign, and it was propelled by mainstream television news channels. And just less than 1% of debates on jobs and unemployment, which was a key issue this election. Most people were feeling really, even if they supported the Bharatiya Janata Party, there was a sense that a real anxiety around jobs, and less than 1% of debates were done, or discussions on television news was done on jobs. So our role at News Laundry is to really look at this, question this, and through this election, you had two principal political groups going at each other, but there was almost a sort of a media war on the sidelines between legacy television news and independent digital media organizations like ours, and even YouTubers who were doing the job of journalists, really, who were doing what journalists weren't doing. So questioning the government on their performance over the last 10 years, talking about the job crisis, talking about unemployment, price rise, versus a television news ecosystem which is way more powerful, which reaches about 900 million people in India, dedicated to just telling Indians that everything is great, everything is wonderful, you don't need to worry, vote this man back in. And so I think the final result of Modi coming back with the weakened mandate was really a win for digital media in India.
Now, I just want to follow up, because what Bey just said is sort of countering disinformation that's seen on social media. But here you have a situation where the main broadcasters, mainstream media, is working quite closely with Modi, is perceived that way.
Yeah.
And so do you see social media differently? Is it less of a threat and more of a tool? Where do you stand on the pros and cons of leveraging
I am a big
social
champion of digital media, social media. I know there are lots of problems there, but I think it's also really democratized the space for us. We couldn't have reached out the audience that we have this election if we didn't have a YouTube to challenge what was happening on television news. So I think I'm a big believer in social media, the power of internet and digital media tools that we've used, whether it's satire on YouTube or whether it's even opposition parties. It was
Right.
very interesting to note. Quickly, I'll add that some opposition parties that felt attacked by television news decided to just not talk to TV news and were directly communicating with their audience through YouTube.
Yeah, and hold this thought, Madhav, but what happens if the government decides to block YouTube, and then YouTube and Google has to or does not have to comply? But I first want to go to Emmanuel. I want to follow up on that question of social media. Does your newsroom view social media as a tool or an enemy of creating disinformation? Where do you fall on the pros and cons, and how have you seen it play out with elections?
Essentially, we are an online-first organization, so we don't necessarily view social media as an enemy. It's a big ally. It's an enabler for our work. So through social media, we're able to reach millions of Kenyans and also millions of Africans. And we do also have a global audience that keeps growing daily. But social media usage, as we have all seen, also comes with its downsides. For us in Kenya, which is our primary audience market, and of course we do have regional audiences. We found that firsthand in 2017 when we were covering the general elections then. Organization is relatively young, but we've been around 2 Kenyan election cycles. And elections in Kenya are very intense, election season is very intense, but also something that has happened over the last 2 decades is a lot more Kenyans have become online, the digital divide has been breached, so that has also had serious implications with regards to how all the players in the election cycle engage. And a lot of that has increasingly become online. So what we saw in 2017 was the use of social media, and back then we didn't know what was happening, but later we got to see the reports that there was the influence of external players like the likes of Cambridge Analytica, and the rest happened with the Trump election in the US. They came, did their thing in Kenya, and then before they went elsewhere, that entire circus. How that played out in Kenya was we had videos, what today we call deepfakes, and all this use of AI to manipulate how people are reacting. We featured some of those in a documentary we did in 2017 called Siasa, Pesa, Propaganda. Siasa is Swahili for politics, and Pesa is Swahili for money, and of course, propaganda. They were titled Real Raila. They were posted on YouTube. They were posted on Twitter. later on they were pulled down because Google later had those, an act to get rid of disinformation campaigns and all, but the damage had been done. So you had videos depicting one of the main presidential candidates who's been the opposition leader in certain ways. For a discerning eye, you could outrightly tell this is propaganda, somebody is paying for this, somebody is sponsoring this disinformation campaign. But for the average social media user, depending on where you fell in the political spectrum, it was a tool to mudsling the other side, and it had its effects. So that went on. That was 2017. Then we had other elections 5 years later in 2022. And this time around, there were both positives and again negatives with how social media was used. And for us as a newsroom, how we were using it is to try to counter some of that. So we've been part of several initiatives. Something happened between 2017 and 2022. We started a fact-checking desk because we found the kind of misinformation we were dealing with was overwhelming. And back then, we didn't know we were going to get a global pandemic. So that even made things worse. So that fact-checking desk, we partnered with other organizations in Kenya who are doing similar fact-checking initiatives, so mainstream media, online media like ourselves, and we came up with an initiative called Fumbua. Fumbua is Swahili for discover. So basically what we are doing is have campaigns that amplify each newsroom's work on social media so that a lot more of the audiences we communicate with, regardless of which media house you come from, are able to get factual content. The initiative even published a toolkit that's there on the side, and they had a robust WhatsApp campaign, and also centrally, it coordinated the efforts of all newsrooms regarding how they were identifying misinformation and disinformation during the elections and amplifying the fact-checked work. So yeah, that's what we've been up to, and that's also how we engage social media. Post-election, of course, our work is to inform, entertain, educate. We don't do a good job with the entertain bit, but we do inform and educate, and right now is holding a lot of the players from those elections to account. So any utterances are fact-checked. We've moved from doing articles to now doing even video-based fact-checks, and that's still a growth process, but helps us maintain some level of sanity on social media, at least across the Kenyan social media side and also the regional. It's too much, so it's not an effort that one newsroom can do, so that's why we collaborate with others to be able to do it, but there are some steps. Yeah.
I mean, in both these fact checkers, Asia fact check, Kenya fact checked, I mean, we're seeing AI, that's going to be a fire hydrant for both of your newsrooms to deal with. But hold that thought, because Madhav, you've been very patient. Listening to these journalists in different newsrooms talk about all this, why don't I just ask if you have any reactions to what has been said over the last 15 minutes or so?
Thank you very much. And I should probably make clear, I left Google 11 months ago, so I'm not speaking on behalf of Google or anything like that. I'm speaking as a
And what were you doing at Google?
So I used to run the news partnerships teams in different parts of the world and helped set up something in Europe called DNI, the Digital News Initiative, and was one of the people that helped set up the Google News Initiative. I think the first thing I need to say is just, bravo. I think the work that the journalists are doing in the countries in particular and in the regions are just, it's extraordinary and it's really important. And there was a discussion, earlier about, is journalism important for democracy? I was one of the people who voted yes, right? But I also thought it was a really interesting, the question from Azerbaijan about what can democracy do for journalism? And I think this is what we're seeing, is that these factors in the digital world can be both good and bad. I mean, I know it sounds blindingly obvious, but I think we need to acknowledge it, because the reality is technology is a tool and it is neither good nor bad, right? It depends on how you use it. And as you see, you have excellent uses of technology, but you also have bad actors who are using that technology in the bad way. And again, apologies for being blindingly obvious, but that's just the way it's going to be, right? And in the introduction, you talked about the headwinds. And I think, yes, you're right, these are headwinds. And if you take that analogy forward, the planes keep going, even into the headwinds. And I think that's the important part, is how do you continually try to understand the platforms, what's being done with them, what the authoritarian regimes are being done with them. Because I think the other thing, and we were discussing this a little bit beforehand, the authoritarian regimes are very smart and active. And they are using the technology to further their gains, which, from my perspective, are not the gains of democracy and of individual citizens, but they're using it that way, and we need to be conscious of that. Because if you go back in time and go to the Arab Spring, the beginning of that, everyone was like, look at what technology has done, isn't that wonderful? It's enabled this, it's wonderful. The sad truth of it is, the authoritarian regimes learned lessons from that, and what's one of the first things they try to do is they try to shut down the internet, right? But then there's more insidious things that are happening as well. You get, you get leaders in democratic countries who make threats about what these technology companies may or may not be doing to try to influence their behavior before they do it, right? You've definitely seen this in India.
Yeah, what happens if Modi's government pushes to Google that you have to shut YouTube down, and they pass legislation for that? What is the responsibility of a company like that? I mean, you were at Google for so long, I know you can't necessarily talk about everything, but what's the sensibility, and where are you seeing big tech headed? Are they going to comply? It seems like they want to comply. I mean, they say they have nothing they can do about that. They have to comply.
I think they will comply up until the point it becomes too egregious. And
how do you define that?
But that point about what is too egregious, I think, unfortunately, that line is moving. So if you look at what Google did, vis-a-vis China, they took a principled view and they pulled out of China, right? In a lot of other countries, they have obeyed, and in India in particular, there has been an inordinate amount of pressure. And one of the things they do, and again, it was referenced in a previous panel, they use the legal laws that exist, the lawfare issue. And so they're not asking Google to shut down YouTube. They're going to go after the individuals, and they're going to do things like, copyright, or they're going to pass laws that give them more influence. And how technology companies navigate that is going to be, I think, one of the defining things for the next number of years.
I want to, actually, we don't have that much time, so I want to go to the rest of you guys and ask that question. What happens to your newsroom if you can no longer broadcast on YouTube, if it's blocked to your audiences? Same thing with Emmanuel, right? You're online, and Bay as well. Manisha.
Well, we in India have formed a coalition of digital news publishers. I think it's very important to get together, get your voices heard. There is a draft digital bill. So I don't think it's going to be, like he said, it's not going to be like a shutdown, but it's going to be, tweaking certain laws that will make it difficult for us to operate as freely as we have been. So there are talks of possibly having a censor board for news online. There's going to be a definition to news. And I think just the very idea of defining news on internet is just, it's so impossible, because it can be so many things. It can be information, it could be, So I think the way they're going to define news, or fake news, so the government also wants to take the onus of, declaring what is fake news or not. So that is also something that we're worried about. So what we want to do is, ideally, and I think this is what everyone should do, is just form coalitions where you can get your voices heard, operate as a body, as an industry body, rather than just being individuals. So that's what we are trying to do in India, at least.
Emmanuel, you mentioned working with other organizations. You're obviously forward planning for eventualities where a platform gets shut down or you face headwinds, like I said. What are you planning in terms of the next election and the worst case scenarios, and how you might work around that?
So Kenya just came from the elections in 2022. So for the next elections, at least they are 3 years away. So we do have some time, and we are using that time to bolster one of our initiatives. We have a product called Shahara Videos. So it's our alternative streaming platform. So say tomorrow we woke up and YouTube doesn't exist. Shahara should allow us to continue with our work. On the platform, we run it. Of course, we've run into all the challenges about building the infrastructure and the distribution and all of that. And we've had an ambitious goal of opening it up to other creators as well, because Shahara is a play on a Swahili word, mshahara, which means salary. So the idea there is to have creators come, upload their content, and have the Kenyan audience pay for it. They make money. So that will be like our doomsday plan, because we primarily published on YouTube for long-form content, and of course, we do short-form content on Instagram, Reels, and TikTok. So if tomorrow those platforms wouldn't exist, we should be able to continue going. But because we are talking about election coverage and it's politics and it's sensitive, there's also the room and the possibility of, say, a blackout. Tomorrow you find YouTube is blocked in your country. It's not a reality we're entertaining as Kenyans, much as it's happening. It's happened all around us. We've had internet shutdowns and everything. But we consider ourselves such a mature democracy that that's a little far-fetched. But should push come to shove, at least at African Censored, we do have a plan B. We should be able to still direct our audiences where to find our content. But the third thing is our partnerships with local media houses in Kenya, regional media houses across the East African region with the basis of the programs that we run, and across the continent and even outside, is strong to the sense that we believe we can rise above any efforts to censor our work, at least in the short term. The unpredictability of the space we are in is such that you really don't know the kind of threats you'd face. For instance, we had a very ambitious 5-year plan in 2019. Then the pandemic came.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doomsday plans. Do you have one, babe?
Well, so it is interesting because, we definitely, I couldn't agree more with Madhav. I think we definitely need social media. I mean, a lot of our audiences, especially in Southeast Asia, actually get a lot of their news from Facebook. So we're like the #1 news organization in terms of engagement on Facebook in Cambodia, for example. And we just started a Pacific news service, so covering the Pacific Islands. And there it's really interesting because technology is kind of leapfrogged, where a lot of people have mobile phones, but data is really expensive. But Facebook has an agreement with the mobile carriers there where they get Facebook for free.
Right.
So anything they
Remember
don't,
that program when they launched, yes.
So exactly. So that's how we reach audiences there. So I think the biggest way to counter that is to diversify. We also broadcast on shortwave, even though it's a
Very old school,
small,
analog.
very old school, exactly. But
Method.
if, like in Burma, the junta closes down the internet, which they did, we still have ways to reach our audience.
Great. We have 2 minutes. Go, Madhav.
No, we should probably take questions.
No.
I was just going to make a comment about what you talked about, what they call the zero rating of Facebook. I don't think it gets talked enough, because a lot of the tech companies do that, and they do that to extend their products. But sometimes the ramifications of that are not what we realize. And I've talked with Maria about this, and for me, my theory is that about Facebook being the internet in the Philippines, it's because of the zero rating, right? And so actually, I think if you're going to look around, you should look around at those zero rating things, because I think they can lead to other things that that may not be obvious at the time.
Unanticipated consequences. Look, I do want to make sure that the submissions that you had are shared. I don't know if it could be made. Is it being shown on screen, or are you picking one slate or the other? Okay. The irony is I actually can't read it. Hold on, because this is blocking me over here. So I'm going to stand up and just share this. What's an innovative format your newsroom covers for elections? One respondent says innovative debate formats, the Oxford debating format, engagement with young people, which we didn't really have a chance to talk about, but hopefully another panel. The difference between Gen Z and Gen Alpha is significant. Social media to capture youth's voices, a mobile first voter guide, data visualization and analysis, measuring the results in geographical participation, and so on and so forth. 40 to 60 second TikTok videos, so don't get me started on that. Look, we're over time. You want to go to lunch. The responses are very interesting. Let's just keep that on there as people mill out. But I want to thank the panelists for your time. Some of you flew in from quite far, so thank you very much.